Welcome to the opening podcast in a series titled Past, Present, and Future: Perspective on Mental Health in the Black Community. This initiative will consist of a series of podcasts, forums, and healing circles over a 6-month period that strive to expose the stigma associated with mental health, encourage open and honest discussion among men, women, and youth, and provide tangible solutions towards healing and recovery. We want to take this opportunity to show appreciation to the City of Toronto for their support towards this endeavor. While the intention of this podcast is to create an environment of knowledge sharing, positive affirmation, and a space for joy, some content may be emotionally triggering and of a sensitive nature. This episode of the podcast features content related to issues of Black mental health, which may be emotionally triggering for some. If you or someone you know is triggered by this content, immediate support is accessible by calling 211. You can speak with a crisis worker at any time. You can also find support on our website at www.blacktothefutureto.com. I am your host, Shireen Ashman, co-founder and director of programs and education. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the first of 12 sessions. Don't forget to join us in our first healing circle, which will be on Wednesday, May the 25th at 5 p.m. Hosting the circle will be myself, Shireen Ashman, along with my colleague, Kofi Morris, Reiki practitioner, cultural educator. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and IG, and you can get directly to us through the website blacktothefutureto.com. Healing circles allow for the formation of relationships, the honoring of voices, and the creation of unity. The process is, at its essence, a story sharing process, which brings together people as equals to have open exchange, oftentimes around difficult issues or painful experiences, in an atmosphere of respect and concern and care for everyone. We'd also like to hear your thoughts. Join us for our discussion forums, where you can share what you think our community needs to address Black mental health. What are we doing well? What needs to change? We want to hear from you, so follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and IG. Join me again, Shireen Ashman, for the second podcast, exploring From Colonial to Neocolonialism, Traumatic Effects of Slavery and Racism on Black Mental Health. We look forward to joining the discussion. Good morning and welcome to the opening podcast in a series titled Past, Present, and Future: Perspectives on Mental Health in the Black Community. This initiative will consist of a series of podcasts, forums, and healing circles over a 6-month period that strive to expose the stigma associated with mental health, encourage open and honest discussions among men, women, and youth, and provide tangible solutions towards healing and recovery. I am your host and moderator, Shireen Ashman, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to the first session of 12. I'm joined by my colleagues who will introduce themselves, starting with Biliana.
Good morning, and it's a pleasure to be here. My name is Biliana Sidadi, and I'm the Program Development Lead here at C, and I'm just excited to be here and have this very important conversation.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Rajendra Rambaju, and I am the Education Consultant and Evaluator at C Center for Young Black Professionals. I joined the C team about 6 months ago, and I'm really excited to be here.
Thank you so much for having me. My name is Tristan. I am a social support worker here at C Center for Young Black Professionals. Excited to heal and learn at the same time. Grateful for this conversation.
So what's interesting is this panel that we have put together of our C colleagues is in and of itself multi-generational. And the focus of this first podcast is historically Black, the Black experiences of multi-generational Black Canadian families. In this podcast, we will have a conversation on the multi-generational Black family experience, discussing the socioeconomic challenges and anti-Black racism that Black families face, while incorporating and looking at historical approach to illustrate how anti-Black racism has been justified, promoted, and how these challenges have negatively contributed to Black mental health. So we have 3 questions, folks. So I'll pose each question and let's just have a conversation. Folks can just popcorn style as we do at our C scrums. So the first question is, how was mental health kind of constructed in a better word, handled in your parents or your grandparents' generation, what you saw? And how are you choosing to handle mental health now? And taking a look at how your generation has constructed it.
I can start. How was mental health looked at in my parents' and grandparents' generation? To be completely honest, it wasn't. I come from a culture where what happens in the home stays in the home, what happens in the family stays in the family. And so, a lot of my family members would turn a blind eye to some of the things that were going on around them, just in an effort to, save face, in an effort to, look complete in the eyes of those around us, right? I would also say my family heavily leaned on the church, right? Leaning on God, hoping to pray, the issues away. And sometimes, that would work, but of course, at other times, you do need to specifically address each independent need. How I choose to deal with it now, I think my dedication to improving my mental health and my community's mental health is reflected in, the work that I do, the organization that was graceful enough to, accept me into their team. But I think healing is something that you have to live every day. There isn't a point in time where I turn it off. If I'm watching something that, I may relate to, I'm healing because I'm accepting my experience. If I'm listening to music, I choose to listen to positive music so that I can heal, while enjoying music. So it's just wrapped up into everything that I do.
I'm hearing that piece around projecting this image of normal or having it together in a way that we sometimes often, like you said, just turn a blind eye, whether intentionally or just through not knowing what to do. It's like, yeah, I can resonate with that for sure. Who wants to add?
I think mental health, for me and my family, similar to what Tristan had mentioned, it really was not a thing for my parents and my grandparents. And I think a big part of that was really just because of the lifestyle that everyone lived. Very similar to what Tristan mentioned, a lot of things were seen as normal. And everyone kind of lived their lives in the private, even though as a kid, I could remember so many issues that my parents were facing privately. Really, that's where it stayed. It stayed private. So I don't think it's something that they acknowledged. I don't even think it's something that they thought as, this is out of the norm or this is affecting me mentally in this state or this could lead to, this severe act or, the way that we see it now is not how they saw it then. And I think that now, even for myself, it's taken a bit of time for me to recognize the importance of my mental health because I grew up with my mom now passing down these beliefs that, you have to be strong and being dismissive of certain things and certain signs of, I'm not okay. And I think for myself, it's really been a process of kind of recognition. And then it's also been a process of educating myself on different ways to better my mental health so that I'm not repeating what I was taught pretty much, which is to dismiss, to ignore, and to keep things private.
So for me, similar to Biliana and Tristan, I had never heard the word mental health growing up. Within my family and within my community, it was something that we had never heard about. What I can remember now, and and now that I can make connections, I used to hear the word saying that people have nerve problem. And so this to me is related to mental health challenges. And it was sort of in a sense that if I don't experience it, then it's not possible for you to experience it. And if you're having challenges, you don't take it outside of the house. You talk inside of the house. But then again, within the home, it wasn't a conversation that you can actually begin because it was sort of abnormal to have challenges. And so for me now, to address that is to begin a conversation. And within that conversation, it's to have a holistic understanding of the entire situation of both successes and also on trauma or experiences that were not so positive for individuals to talk about, because that's the only way you can really understand the challenges and know how to support and advocate for someone who is having challenges. And for me now also to address mental health or to have a conversation, we have to acknowledge the pain or sufferings that a particular population, and say, for example, Black families face, and to understand their history of colonization, of slavery, of segregation, of racism, and discrimination. Because from what I know and from my experience, if you feel excluded, it plays on your mental health and it can cause challenges for you and people around you. And so for me, we need to have a conversation. You need to talk about it. And you need to have people you can rely on that would listen to you. Sometimes you just don't need somebody to give you solutions. All you need is for them to listen to you, to feel listened to and feel heard.
There's so many pieces of that I resonate with, right? So for myself, the term mental health, that is something that I learned academically. There was no term to what perhaps we have witnessed. It's not that we have not seen certain behaviors in our communities or even in our families or even within ourselves, right? But i.e. growing up, there was not a term put to it, or if there was a term, it was quite filled with stigma and negative, right? So people talk about, Imad or Shaman, or you know what I mean, but not looking at the dynamics of mental health. That was never constructed, or framed at all. But now the approach is understanding, or this idea growing up that you just push through things, right? You have to be strong, you have to be tough, and just push through things. Well, for me, it's the balancing of resilience can absolutely live with vulnerability, and both of them are equally beneficial to my development. I can't be, that's important, and I try to hold that space, and I take a very holistic approach now that my mental health is a big part of my health, but so is understanding somatic health, my physical health, my spiritual health, etc. Right? So it's this holistic idea, and really, like what Tristan said, practice. It's not just talking about it, like how are we actually practicing it, So thinking about a different kind of concept or discussion in how we grew up, how have we as people of African Canadian descent conceptualized or prepared our families for anti-Black racism in Canada? How was it discussed in your families? How do you think you were prepared or not?
So preparation started as far back as I can remember. My mom always made sure to have one-on-one discussions with me about how to show up in society. Um, and she especially drilled, the concept of understanding that the burden to stay alive and the burden of performance is on me, right? So some of these discussions could have centered around, how do you behave when you're at the mall, knowing that people are going to be looking at you as if you are some type of criminal or more prone to violence? How do you conduct yourself, when a police officer pulls you over, or if my mom gets pulled over and I'm in the back seat as a child, right? These were all different conversations that we had, and it was really interesting because as I grew up, as I, got some forms of independence, at one point or another in my life, I was put into these situations, right? I was put into a situation driving with my mom, and she's driving a BMW, and a police officer pulls us over and asks her if the car is rented, just to ask her if she owned the car, right? And how was I supposed to show up in that moment? Do I get angry and cause a scene, which could then escalate the situation, or do I follow, my mother's teaching and understand that I am held to a higher standard than pretty much everybody else in society, right? And the way that I am able to understand it now is, you know, we as Black people, we carry so much burden because in many instances we are the foundation for the societies that we are um, you know, put down in, right? We are the foundation. And so I try to share those same conversations with individuals, youth that are younger than me now, just letting them understand that it is on you to be able to leave your house and get back home safely. And anti-Black racism can show itself in so many different forms. It's best to prepare yourself, as young as possible so that you can identify it instead of walking blindly.
But then, Tristan, it makes you question or wonder about the impact of this hypervigilance that most folks seem to carry as a part of the tax, the emotional burden of anti-Black racism in just daily life. Just being so hypervigilant about your identity, where you are in space, how you take up space, or not.
So I agree 100%. And I think, I was having a discussion with someone about, the impact of always having to be on, right? The impact of always having to be perfect, of always having to be alert, of always having to be aware. And, what that does to us, right? Not being able to feel safe in environments where pretty much every other human being can feel safe in, right? And like I said, I was really grateful to have that conversation because it kind of opened my eyes to the almost superhuman role that we constantly have to play.
It's so great hearing, Tristan, that our experiences could be so similar, but like our upbringings could be so different. Like for myself, even though I know my parents experienced racism in so many different forms, it was never a conversation that happened growing up. I think that a lot of that is because of trauma and fear, where they just didn't want to bring that up or share with us. And I think I also grew up in a household where we weren't very open in having those types of conversations and those difficult conversations. My dad um, my dad worked in the police force and back when we were still in Angola. And so I think he had that very, on guard, always tough skinned type of mentality when he was raising us. Um, and it's crazy that when we immigrated to Canada and he began to have these experiences, he would still not bring it up. He would still have that on guard of, I have to be the tough person. So I think for me, it was never a conversation in order to prepare myself. But as I got older, I began to kind of see it. So it was more so I started to see the different situations that specifically my dad, because that's who I grew up with when I first immigrated to Canada, was experiencing and how he was dealing with it. And I could just always see the fear in him. And I think that that's what I took from him, you know, in situations of racism, and how he dealt with it was through fear. And so that's how I started to deal with it, was through fear. And oftentimes, you know, whether it's simply when we're driving and the police car isn't even stopping us, but just passing us, how he would react. It was always a very, you know, slow down, you know, make sure I have all my documents with me, double check everything. I started to internalize that. And it wasn't until I was driving by myself that I started to notice that I was, you know, mimicking those same behavior, that I was like, I need to pause and kind of reevaluate how did I get to this point? And really it was just through observation. So I was never prepared for it, to answer the question. I had to kind of prepare myself. And now I'm starting to, I guess, as I'm learning, you know, of the fact that, yeah, anti-Black racism is something that I have dealt with in so many different ways, even as simple as going to the mall and walking into a store, right, that people might assume is outside of my pay rate or outside of what I can afford, and being looked at and asked certain questions in certain ways, having to kind of go back and, you know, how I dealt with that. And I guess just unlearning, a lot of unlearning for myself. And so, yeah, I was never prepared for it. And right now I feel like I'm in a place where I'm starting to prepare myself and learning and know, and even teaching my parents now too, you know, kind of opening up their eyes to how they've been able to deal with it over the years. And, you know, I think we've become a little bit more stable in the sense that we are more open to having these conversations as a family unit. And it's been a very interesting dynamic. But it was just interesting to hear, Tristan, that, you know, it's something that your parents had prepared you from such a long, you know, from such a young age. And for myself, it's something that I'm preparing myself for now, and helping my parents kind of prepare themselves again, unlearn a few behaviors and prepare themselves again for, you know, the different ways that they are dealing with it in society today.
For me, my role is a little bit different because I'm the first generation here, so I had to do that for my children, and because I know that racism is interwoven within the society we live in. I know it was my responsibility to begin that conversation with my children in a way that I look at it this way, that, you know, because racism is in this society, I don't have to be a non-racist, but I must be an anti-racist, right? In that way. And also because I know the impact it can cause when you feel that you're being treated differently because of your race. I know it can cause, you can feel frustrated, you can feel confused, you feel unsafe, even ashamed of yourself, you feel inferior. So I thought it was important for me to have that conversation with my children. And I always, you know, told them, and, you know, be mindful what you say and what you do when you go out. And I started this conversation even before they started school. Be mindful what you say and do, because people may treat you based on what you say or do. And while it's not right for them to treat you that way, you still need to be mindful, because you don't want to be stereotyped. And, you know, I had conversations with them daily, every day they returned home from school, things that were good about school, what wasn't so good in and out of inside and outside of school. So I would learn about their experiences at school, and based on that, I would communicate with the school if I felt that it had any relationship with racism, and I would label it, because I always thought, and that was even before I started to learn in the academic context about racism, because I always thought if you don't talk about it, you cannot address it. So I would have this conversation with them. And also, you know, in a way, while you might not care what others say about what you say or do, we don't want to be disrespected. We don't want to feel disrespected. We don't want to feel excluded. We don't want to feel unsafe. So I feel it was important to have that conversation with them. And so that was my approach in preparing my children for face with that kind of issue out in society. Sorry. Thank you.
Yeah, there seems to be like for, it being presented as a fact of life. It was never like, anti-Black racism, just racism as a fact of life. And the responsibility was on like individualized to yourself and your community, in yourself, your family, your community, and largely presented as the way in which you deal with it is you outperform it. You're Black, therefore you have to be 10 times better. So, yes, it's a fact of life, but you cannot change what the system or the structure is, therefore you deal with it by outperforming, proving that you're better or worthy of just being you. So it's to Biliana's point, a lot of unlearning that. And a lot of removing this idea of, which is colonial in and of itself, this focus on work and performance and overworking, it's giving, a lot of what our family and ancestors have gone through. So it's interesting. The preparation now as a parent for my two sons, I do present it as this is something that we deal with as a society. This is what happens in community, but the responsibility just doesn't live on just yourself. Like we have to do something together, and here's how. So, when we've already dealt with situations around my son facing anti-Black racism below age 10 in his school setting from peers and teachers. But I'm just grateful that we've always had this open communication around it, and they know the nature of the work that I do, that it's like, their antennas are up like, this don't, mommy, this happened, this don't feel right.
I wanted to say, I really like that, Shireen, that the way that you present it to your kids, and I guess the approach that it's not something individual. It's not something that we're dealing with individuals or can't deal with it as individuals, but it's something that's going to take a community to kind of, handle. And I think that's important because it's such a load on one person to always feel like I've done something wrong or I'm doing something wrong. But the reality is when we even look at, anti-Black racism in the bigger term, it's embedded in the Canadian society, right? Other societies as well, but specific to Canada, it's embedded in the Canadian society, in our policies. So it's like, how can one single person, even though we're all dealing with different situations, handle that? So I really like that approach, that it really is going to take a community, and it's in order for us to, combat it. And again, just unlearn a lot of the things that we've been taught. And on the bigger term, it's going to take a lot of system change as well, for us to begin to see, hopefully, our kids and their kids not have to deal with a lot of the things that we're experiencing today. So again, it goes back to generation, but the work began with, a lot of our grandparents and people that came before us, and really it continues on in that way.
So a quick question for the parents, in the discussion. What has it been like now? I'll say especially for you, Shireen. What has it been like now teaching the next generation? Like, how has that affected you? How does it feel to kind of close that cycle? And was there anything that you took from the discussions that your parents would have had with you that proved to be a great asset in the discussions that you had with your children?
Such a big question, Tristan. I mean, like I said, it's a practice. And what I think is what I hope is of benefit to my children is that we've began their practice at a younger age. I started to practice, to Biliana's point, this idea of a learning in my adulthood, at university, being introduced to new concepts and being introduced to even the concept of anti-Black racism and having it as a framework and looking at it through different lenses and how it's so insidious and finds it ways in our policies and how we structure culture and in every facet of life, right? So I hope the value that my children gain is that we have begun discussion around this at a young age, that we've begun unlearning it and showing different perspective of it, that it isn't individualized, it is systemic, it is community, right? But you have a responsibility as a person living and walking through life in a Black body to demonstrate how you value your own self. And that means you have to speak up for yourself. So if anything, I'm hoping that's the lesson I'm leaving.
Just to follow up though, what has that impact been like on you to still have to teach these lessons, right? Lessons that were taught to you, as a child, or, if you came to Canada at a certain age. How does it impact you to still have to have these discussions?
I mean, there is a burden to it, and there is a burden to it from your mental health, from your emotional health, because for myself, activism around this is life. Like this is not just something that I talk about. This is something that I live. I live it. I work around system change around it, equity changes around it, right? So it's not just something that I'm, just love. This is what I do, what I live. So that it continues. My hope is that one day I work, it resolves itself, that I don't have a job around this. This is not something that we deal with as a society, right? So, there is a mental health challenge to it for sure. It challenges your just your general well-being, because there's a burden to it. That's the honesty. That's the honest truth.
I'd love to hear your input as well, Raj.
So I guess because I know it's structural, and I know that society and organizations are still structured that way, where policies and practices that discriminate against certain groups, that these practices are accepted. So for me, a lot of times, while I might get sort of upset, where it's like Shireen said, it's emotionally and mentally draining at times, I would tell myself, okay, I have to talk this again. I have to go over this again. And so it becomes frustrating after a while, especially if it's the same individual or the same institution you have to reach out to. And I have been doing that at my children's school all the time, because when I moved here 7 years ago, there were very few like my children that attended the schools they attended. And so constantly I would have to reach out to the school and I would say, well, have you realized what you're saying or what you're doing or your policies are marginalized some students? And the part that would make me more frustrated is when the persons I speak to would try to generalize it in terms of saying, well, here, that is not, we don't do this. We are all very, very inclusive. And I guess because of my age and because of who I am, I would verbalize and I would say, we or you. I would ask the question, we don't do that here, or we're very inclusive, or are you inclusive? So yes, it's becoming tiring sometimes, although I know that this is the system we have, but at the same time, I'm learning and learning more to realize that we're in a society that policies that discriminate are seen as standard.
No, I mean you did, and it was right up the alley of what I was going to pose next, which is just thinking about, well, in a different context, thinking about anti-Black racism and in the workplace, and how what you saw in terms of how your parents or grandparents handled that, and how you're looking to handle that now in this generation. What is something that you're really proud of that this generation is doing differently? So how was, anti-Black racism handled by your parents in their working life? What did you notice? And what are you really excited or proud of about how this generation is reconceptualizing or reimagining that?
Okay, I'll go. So just speaking specifically of my mother, she's a very accomplished family law lawyer. And, growing up, I kind of watched her have this approach to her work life of just putting your head down and persevering through whatever it is that you have to go through. Right. And my mom would have been one of, let's say, three, Black people in her graduating class for law school. One of few to pass the bar at that time in the 90s of color. And, she graduated with these dreams of working downtown and was able to, fairly quickly accomplish that dream. I think it's the culture of being a downtown working lawyer that served as a shock to her. Because, as I'm sure many of you guys know, when you are one of few in a space, people tend to other you, especially when you're Black, right? And so she went from these othering environments, right? Moving to Dorval from Barbados, being one of maybe two Black people in that space. Coming to Toronto, where she's more surrounded by people that look like her, but then attempting to excel in areas of academia that really doesn't have great representation. And so as she got these jobs working downtown, she actually experienced a lot of, I would say, anti-Black racism, discussions. I'll just share, she even had somebody make a comment to her about, being able to rub off her makeup and she would be a different color underneath. Right. So what I seen from her at that time was coming home, we would have discussions about her experience, but I would see her get back up the next day and go back to work. And it wasn't until a specific incident happened that I think shaped who she was going to be for the rest of her career. Because this particular instance really kind of made her have to look in the mirror and decide if she was going to be somebody who stood by idly while others attempted to victimize her and others that look like her, or if she would be a trailblazer. And at that moment, she decided to be a trailblazer. So she left her job. She ended up going to work at a law firm in Markham and, started putting the pieces in place to where she could be a boss and make room and space for women of color to be able to come in and create long-lasting, careers in family law. So I understand that, speaking about my mother, sometimes it's almost as if she's an anomaly because, when she told me these stories and as I sit down here and reflect and talk about them with you guys, I recognize the amount of courage that it would have taken to be able to just leave your job when you experience, an unjust situation, right? When you are constantly othered and you take it and take it and take it. I think the lesson that I took from her was, how do I react when I reach my breaking point? Because she didn't lash out, right? She didn't make a scene. She didn't conduct herself in a way that she feels and I feel as though is beneath her. She strategized. She bared that burden, right? The emotional burden. It was a traumatic event for her, but she used it as fuel, just as she would have taught me, her son, just as she would have taught each and every Black boy that I would have brought over to the house, because she was raising my entire community. She taught us to, don't lay down, don't just feel, but do, right? And as you do, more answers will come, and you'll be able to look back and realize that you've paved an entire road for others to come up and utilize after you.
That's so amazing.
Very. Thanks for sharing that, Tristan.
How about other folks? How was it kind of shaped?
I think I can't speak much to how my parents would have dealt with it, I guess, in their workplace, just because, again, that's not something that I really got to hear a lot about. But I can speak to kind of how this generation deals with it. I love that we are now living in a generation where we know who we are, or we have a better sense of who we are, and we have a better sense of, there's more awareness around anti-Black racism, and therefore there's more awareness around what's just and what's unjust. And so when these different situations do take place, where someone might be feeling like, I'm being discriminated against, or, this is, it doesn't, this isn't right, or this is unfair, I think that we're now more outspoken. And that's something I love. I love that we've gotten to this point where nothing is really hidden anymore, and things can openly be put out. People can openly share, we know our rights, we know policy, and we're really not afraid to kind of speak out. And, that's why I'm so glad that you shared your mother's experience, Tristan, because it's like when I look at, or when I talk to, you're right, it takes a courage. It still takes a courage, and it still takes, you have to be so bold to do something like that, because it's like you're leaving behind a piece of something that you've worked so hard to achieve. And even when I speak to friends today, it's the same instance. It's just that for many of them, they might not wait as long before they do it, because they just know better, right? Or they know that I know what injustice now looks like, because, it's out there. Like there's greater knowledge of what it is. And so something that I just so much value that we've been able to get to this point in this generation is that things are slowly coming to light. Everything that was hidden is slowly coming to light. We're able to recognize it, and we're able to call it out when it happens, right? It still takes the courage, and it still takes the boldness to do it. But I think in this generation, we're doing it sooner and unashamed, kind of calling it out for what it is. And I'm just really glad that we've gotten to this point. And I think that gives me the hope of where we're going when it comes to dealing with these different injustices in our society. So yeah, that's something that I've noticed. That's something that I've been able to participate in, even in my old workplace, where I felt like I wasn't being heard, where I was literally the only Black person in the boardroom not in the boardroom, but in rooms or in meetings at times. And, how that made me feel, and kind of making the decision to, hey, even though this is a place where I've been working out for a very long time, let me get up and go do something else, because I just don't feel like I'm being treated as I should in this space. And having the courage to do that and not wait such a long period before I did. And I'm so glad that I did, because it's kind of what led me to be here at C. So we're definitely seeing, there's progress. There's definitely progress. And we can see that in just how we're able to handle different situations in today's society. Yeah.
And can I just quickly just add, very quickly, I think our generation having social media will play such an integral role. Like social media has been such a great tool in being able to expose some of, the atrocities that we as a people have to go through, right? Twitter, I've seen countless people expose bad behavior, and I've seen ramifications for that bad behavior. Whereas in the past, my mom's generation, yeah, maybe you could take out an ad in the paper, you know what I mean? But there was no way to really, spread this information like wildfire like there is today. And I think that has played a very big role in empowering my generation. Right? Yeah, sure, we may sit down and take some of the things that are happening to us, but we also have our cameras as a tool to kind of keep people in check, because there is now, you know, um, there are now consequences. Even if you don't lose your job, society will look at you in a certain way for some of the behavior that you display. So people, I think the use of social media kind of gives us a little bit of power to put the burden back on individuals who are not behaving in the way that they should.
100%. 100%. And I love that I love that we have that, and that we're definitely using it for good.
With respect to your point on social media, also, Christian, I think there is value to that, but also, we're consistently seeing in media instances relating to racism, but at the same time, is sort of reinforcing to people who experience this, because a lot of people have heard this from their family members or their ancestors about experience this kind of thing. And so when we're seeing that, it's telling us, yes, this still exists, it's still happening, and this can contribute sort of to individuals who experience this sort of feeling of learned helplessness, where, no matter what I do is not enough. And so this is why it's important to label these things when you see them, because if we don't label them, individuals can internalize what they're going through. And so for me, I haven't had, like, my parents never experienced this, because my parents, I was raised back home, so I am here now, and I do it for my children and others. So I would always, if I'm in a public space and I hear or see something that I think is related to racism, I would ask questions. I said, why do you feel you have the right to speak for that person like that? Or why, even in stores, I would do it. Or why do you think you have the right to treat that person that way? Whether it's a customer or a staff, I would always intervene and say something, because I think if we don't, I see myself as a bystander. So I would always say something, and I think that is one way of addressing it.
Roz, I just wanted to commend you, because what you're saying is you're talking about acts in which you display, the greatest form of bravery, right? Which is to put yourself in the line of fire for others, right? Not necessarily to defend yourself, but to defend others. And I'm sure that you're doing it for individuals of all walks of life. And I just wanted to touch on the point of learned helplessness. And, I totally agree with you, because in 2020, when all of the media coverage started going to some of the atrocities that were happening to Black people in North America, there was definitely points where I kind of had that, like, oh, there's nothing that we could do about this. This is happening again. You know what I mean? It's going to continue to happen. But I think platforms like this, platforms that are Black led, Black focused, can provide some balance to that, right? And I think as we continue to have these discussions, we can all as a community eventually to start putting in actions, right? Actionable items that we can do to see, even if it is the most minute level of change, in our communities, it's still a level of change. It's still moving forward. And I think that sometimes, at least for me, that small feeling of helplessness really proved to be like fuel to the fire that I needed to push me in the direction that I chose to go in terms of my career, right? And I recognize that I may be, one of few who are able to see this and use it as fuel, but I'm just hoping that there will be some that are able to, take some of the negatives that we go through, turn it into a positive, and then make ways for others to come in and, add to the discussion, add to the movement, add to the push for the future that we want.
And just to add, I think that's something that I've already seen happen in so many different ways, that what we were experiencing with watching different videos, and whether it was images, whether it was videos, whether it was hearing things in the news. I think for a lot of people that I'm connected to, for them, it birthed out businesses, it birthed out services to our community and for our community. And I think that's one thing that I have noticed happen, and I hope continues to happen, where, we're not just seeing the injustice happen, but, we're kind of allowing ourselves to also say, okay, this is what's happening. What can I do about it? And being the solution for our community, and putting in place what we didn't have and what we know we need. For example, I have friends who have started their own practices just around therapy, because they've recognized that this is something that my circle of friends need, right? And so I think that's where it's also becomes, not to say that, we seeing it does not, or seeing these injustices happening on videos, on cameras, does not affect us negatively, but saying that on the flip side, it could also have a positive effect, where it's birthing out different things in us and in our community, such as the right services that we might need to kind of help ourselves heal.
Thanks for sharing that, everybody. So that brings us to the end of our